Testing 1, 2.
Good evening, everyone. We've now reached 7 o'clock, and so we're at the scheduled time for the start of this Council Executive meeting, and I'd like to welcome you all to the meeting. My name's Stephen Conway. I'm the leader of the Council and the Executive Member for Housing and Partnerships, and I'll be chairing the meeting this evening. Before we move into the business of the meeting, can I just remind you of a few house rules. Could you ensure that any mobile devices, mobile phones included, are switched off? And if you're participating via Teams, when you're not speaking or being asked to speak, could you please mute your microphones? And please note that the meeting is currently being webcast live. I'm going to introduce you now to the people in the room. I'm going to start with the officers of the council who are arrayed in front of me. I'm going to move from left to right. We have Lucian Bowker from Democratic Services and Priya Patel from Democratic Services, Andrew Moulton, who's the council's monitoring officer, Graham Ebers, who's the Deputy Chief Executive and Chief Finance Officer, Matt Pope, who's the Executive Director for Children, Adults and Health, and David Allen, who's the council's Head of Comms, Communications. And online, we're joined by Helen Watson, who is the Director of Children's Services. So those are the officers in the room. I'm going to ask the other executive members to introduce themselves and explain very briefly what their role is. So we start over here with you, Paul.
Good evening. My name's Paul Fishwick. I'm the executive member for Active Travel, Transport and Highways.
I'm Ian Shenton, executive member for Environment, Sport and Leisure.
Lindsay Ferris, executive member for Planning and Local Plan.
Imogen Shepherd-Bay, executive member for Finance.
Prue Bray, I'm the executive member for Children's Services, and I think you'll be hearing quite a lot from me this evening.
Rachel Bishop Firth, executive member for Equalities, Inclusion and Fighting Poverty.
Clive Jones, I'm the executive member for Business and Economic Development.
David Hare, executive member for Adult Services, Wellbeing and Health.
Thank you, colleagues. We have only one apology for absence that's been submitted. That's from Sarah Kerr. I don't believe there are any other absences because I think all other executive members are present. So can I move on now to the next item in the agenda? That's declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest? If there are, you need to tell us what item on the agenda that interest relates to. I don't believe there are any. There's only one item on the agenda that we're going to be discussing this evening. So I see no declaration of interest. The following item on the agenda is a statement from the leader. I do not propose to give a statement. I think we should move on to the substance of this meeting as soon as we can. So the next point for us to consider is the public questions that have been submitted. And the first of those is from Chris Roberts. And I think, Chris, you're with us online. Good evening, Chris. Would you like to ask your question?
Good evening. Yes, hello. First of all, thank you for the Chamber for allowing me to ask my question this evening. It's appreciated. Many families, such as my own, have profoundly disabled children. The respite or special college placement such as Newbury allows us to remain together as a family unit. If the executive falls through this short-sighted proposal, then it will become a Pyrrhic victory of monumental proportions. Many young people will no longer be able to attend their college courses and will remain at home with their family carers 24/7. The sheer pressure will lead to family breakdowns and considerable additional work for your social worker teams. From a financial perspective, the weekly residential care cost for a young person with complex and profound needs ranges from £5,000 to over £8,500 per week. You may save over £500,000 on your transport budget, but your adult social care budget would have increased exponentially. Through social worker and emergency placement costs, whilst your residential care costs will go up by millions more. Please listen to the parents who continue to care for our disabled young people at home. The only result of this policy will be to break up families, cause heartbreaking confusion for the disabled, whilst costing the council millions more in residential placement costs. Is this something you really want to do? Thank you.
you for your question, Chris. I'm going to turn to Prue to answer the question. I think all of the questions are directed at Prue this evening.
Thank you, Stephen. Mr. Roberts, we appreciate that many families will be concerned about changes to homeschool transport policies, but it would not make sense for us to make changes which resulted in huge additional costs elsewhere. And we wish to reassure you and other potential service users that we will assess each case on its merit and in the best interest of the young person and the council. There is no change to our existing approach, that we will continue to make an appropriate alternative arrangement to meet children and young people's needs where exceptional situations justify it.
Have you got a supplementary question you'd like to ask, Chris?
Yes, I have indeed. It's really a point to make. As a special needs parent who chose a college place for my profoundly disabled son, I had to choose a place in Newbury, and the distance wasn't through choice. It was because there was nothing suitable in the immediate surroundings. My young son has got a condition called road blindness, which means he just runs out into the road, and it was deemed unsafe for him to attend either Reading College or to attend Bracknell College and Wokingham College. And Newbury College, because it literally sits in a field miles from anywhere, was deemed to be the only safest place. So in terms of the people and the young families with special needs who do have further placements, this was not a decisions that have been taken lightly. That they have been placed at these establishments which are further from their homes, purely based upon health and safety needs.
Yeah, I understand exactly what you're saying, and I think you're not the only person who is worried that we might try to change that sort of placement. Will be placing children in accordance with their needs and not trying to make them go to the nearest establishment if that's not suitable for them. I hope some of the answers to later questions will bring some of that out for you more. But we would have no intention of trying to change what we need to do. And you do make reference to another important point, which is we don't really have sufficient in-borough provision for post-16. And that is something that we are looking at because it's a gap in our provision.
Thank you, Chris, for your question. You're very welcome to stay and listen to the other questions as well and the answers Prue gives to those. Thank you, Chris. So we now move on to a question that's been submitted by Sarah Clark. I understand that Sarah is neither with us online nor in person, but I'm going to read out Sarah's question and Prue is going to read out her answer to it. Ordinarily, if somebody wasn't here, they would simply get a written response. But given the importance of the subject we're discussing, I think it's helpful that we're clear about the questions that have been asked and we're clear about the responses that are being given in a public way rather than just to the individuals who've sent in the question. So Sarah's question was, please can it be explained how the transport policy change to independent travel and personal budgets for those with SEND is going to reduce the transport budget when there is no cost analysis of the current costs for post-16 or what the cost of the proposed changes potentially will be. No information on numbers, travelling, distances currently being travelled, and whether or not personal budgets will cover those costs or be overpaying for that travel. What will be the potential cost of travel training and personal budgets versus current transport costs, and how can the committee make an informed decision without this information?
Okay, so the proposed change to the post-16 transport offer to independent travel training and a personal budget as the default options is part of the overall package, which is aimed at ensuring we have a sustainable home-to-school transport service for the long term.
If you can hear me online, we're just having a short adjournment because there's technical difficulty. We'll be back as soon as possible.
One, two.
Testing, testing.
Okay, we are back online. I think everything is now working. Fingers crossed. Thank you for those who've stayed with us in that rather unfortunate little interlude. So we're going to resume. Prue was in the middle of answering a question from Sarah. I think it's probably most helpful if she starts again in her answer rather than picks up where she left off.
I'd only done the first sentence anyway, so I will start again. So the proposed change to the post-16 transport offer to independent travel training and a personal budget as the default options is part of the overall package, which is aimed at ensuring we have a sustainable home-to-school transport service for the long term, rather than immediately reducing spend. In particular, with this particular change, we want to do better and prepare our young people for adulthood and future employment. And we aim to provide our young people with the skills and resources they need to become more independent. Personal budgets will empower young people and their families by giving them the flexibility to make their own choices, which suit their own circumstances and individual needs. And they are already in use in other local authority areas. We cannot predict what proportion of young people will have personal transport budgets or travel training, or exactly where young people will be studying or how far they will have to travel, or indeed how many young people will qualify for travel assistance in total in future years. And this makes it nigh on impossible to provide a meaningful cost comparison between the current spend and future spend on post-16 transport, which is why we have not provided one. But to give you some idea of what the impact may be, in the 2022-23 academic year, there were 62 post-16 students receiving travel assistance from the council. 2/3 of post-16 students were travelling to post-16 education in Wokingham Borough, to Reading or Bracknell and Wokingham colleges, or to Berkshire College of Agriculture. There are public transport networks or a bespoke college coach network in place to aid travel to these destinations. Looking at what would happen if we were to pay mileage instead of having a personal transport budget, in 65% of cases, a mileage payment would be less, removing the flexibility for a young person to make their own choices about how they travel. Where mileage payments could be more, in most cases, there are travel options which can be achieved within the personal budget. For cases where there are no suitable travel options, the proposed post-16 policy includes an appeals process which allows cases to be reviewed on an individual case-by-case basis. This means that if it turns out that, for example, council-operated transport is the right option for a particular student, that option will still be available.
Thank you, Prue. As Sarah isn't here, I'm afraid that there can't be a supplementary question. The next question is from Terry Walsh, and I don't believe Terry is here either. So I'm going to follow the same pattern as I did with Sarah's question, and I'm going to read out the question from Terry Walsh and then invite Prue to provide the answer, so everyone can hear what the question was and know what the answer is. So Terry's question is, please can the nearest suitable learning provider is the closest school or college to the home address able to offer a suitable level of study be clarified to make it clear that in line with the post-16 transport and travel to support education statutory guidance, January 2019, the local authority, and it's a quote here, must have regard to the need to ensure that young people have reasonable opportunities to choose between different establishments at which education is provided, and that a young person will be able to choose the post-16 course they wish. For example, electrician over catering as opposed to level of training course, which may mean attending a closer college but not doing the course or qualification that they want to do in order to qualify for travel assistance. Wokingham Borough Council need to ensure a SEND young person has the same right to study a course of their choosing as their peers, and they shouldn't be forced into a course not of their choosing due to just needing to meet a level of education.
So the council would not want to disadvantage any young person from making a reasonable choice for their future education. The post-16 travel assistance policy is applicable to all post-16 students, including those young people with special educational needs and disabilities, SEND. Travel assistance will be considered to the nearest setting that indicates they can deliver the provision that a young person with additional needs or disabilities requires to meet their needs, as well as offering an appropriate accompanying course. An appropriate course is one that enables a young person to meet their learning and/or employment objectives, or is specifically designed to meet the student's special educational needs. For young people with SEND, preferred courses should be discussed at their annual review, and their views and aspirations will be considered along with how their choice of course will meet their learning objectives. Subsequently, their education, health and care plan and any course named within the plan for post-16 education would be considered as reasonable choice for transport purposes. Now, you will have noticed that I have used the word reasonable several times. That is a word which appears in the legislation. There are bound to be cases where reasonableness is disputed. For example, if the choice is between an NVQ level 2 in carpentry at a nearby provider and NVQ level 2 in joinery at one further away. But each case will be looked at on an individual case-by-case basis to ensure that we meet the needs of the young person as well as we can. Finally, there was no intention to change this aspect of the policy, but it seems our rewording for clarity did not work, as it resulted in a lot of discussion at the Children's Services Overview and Scrutiny meeting, and Terry has asked this question. To give you, that's Terry, but everybody, some reassurance, we have revisited this and reworded it, and I repeat that the situation with regard to choice of course remains as it was before.
Thank you, Prue. Now we move to Matthew Lawler's question, and Matthew is here, he's in the chamber. Welcome, Matthew. Would you like to ask your question of Prue?
Thank you, Chair. Good evening. Given that unlike parents, the Council Transport Planning Team has the technical expertise to evaluate transport provider bids and their suitability, including enhanced criminal record checks, etc. for safeguarding, a combined transport demand, which enables price competition, the legal clout of the Council legal team to enforce contracts, and the ability to combine multiple passengers into shared journeys, which is more efficient on resources and for the environment and congestion, can the travel policy specify for 16 to 19s include the continued provision for council organised and funded transport for vulnerable and SEND young people where they are not able to travel independently to their nearest suitable school, college or supported internship?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Lawler. The Council's post-16 transport policy is aimed at preparing our young people for adulthood and future employment. We aim to provide our young people with the skills and resources they need to become more independent. Personal budgets will empower young people and their families to make their own choices, which suit their own circumstances and individual needs. Where additional support for families is needed to help identify travel options, the Council can look at the best way this support can be provided. If a young person's needs are such that they cannot travel independently to their nearest suitable school, college or supported internship, the post-16 policy includes an appeals process which allows for cases to be looked at on an individual basis. Now, to put all that a different way, we want to do what we can to help prepare SEND young people for adulthood, and giving options for travel to their post-16 education is part of promoting the idea of independence, which is something that will help equip them for the future. We know that this is not realistic for everyone, and that some young people will still need council-operated transport, and that option will still be available for those who are assessed as needing it. So to answer your question directly, yes, the policy does include the possibility of council-operated transport for SEND young people where they are not able to travel independently.
Thank you, Prue. Matthew, do you have a supplementary?
Yes, please. If you can't travel independently, because you can't cross the road, for example, or the condition that Chris has mentioned already, the need to go through another appeal is another battle for special needs families. And can you consider that you could make sort of centrally organised transport an outcome of an application rather than needing to go through an appeal process to the personal travel budget?
Right. You're happy for me to answer that? That's an interesting point. I think we wanted to make the personal travel budget the default option, which makes it difficult to put the other one in as a first option. But there are undoubtedly children for whom council operated transport will be the only outcome. And so I think we'll consider how that will operate. I would also like to add to that once a child has got, so if you've got a child who at the moment has got post-16 transport and in a council operated vehicle, that will not be changed unless their circumstances change or they're assessed as something in a different way. So we're not planning to suddenly, when this comes in next year, take away council operated transport from people who've already been given it unless there is a change in their circumstances. And I hope that gives you some reassurance towards it, but we will look at the point you've made because it's I can understand where you're coming from.
Thank you, Prue. Now the next question is from Rachel Lawler. She's unfortunately not able to be here, but I think Matthew is going to ask her question for her. But as I explained at the beginning of the meeting, or before the meeting started, Matthew, you won't, unfortunately, on this occasion have the chance for a supplementary.
Thank you, Chair. Young people with special educational needs have limited options for post-16 education. One option for EHCP learners is a supported internship, a full-time educational programme with work placements. The national guidance states in section 22 that arrangements to support learners undertaking apprenticeships and traineeships should also be set out in the transport policy. I can see no information on this in the proposed policy. Will you please confirm that a section on this will be included and that young people with SEND will be supported to travel to such a programme?
So section 3 of the post-16 transport policy sets out the eligibility criteria which the council will use to identify if a young person will be provided with travel assistance. If a full-time educational programme with work placements is provided by a school, a further education institution, a council-maintained or assisted institution providing higher or further education, an establishment funded directly by the Education, Skills and Funding Agency, or a learning provider delivering accredited programmes of learning which lead to positive outcomes and are funded by the council, for example, colleges, charities and private learning providers. Then travel assistance will be assessed to this provider's location. The standard transport offer will be a personal budget, and it will be for the young person to determine how to spend their personal budget to access any work placements which form part of their course. If the young person is not enrolled on a full-time course, which is provided by one of the above providers, they will not meet the eligibility criteria for travel assistance. Section 2 of the post-16 transport policy provides information about travel assistance offered by external organisations and is applicable to all young people, including those who do not meet any other eligibility criteria. In all cases where a young person or their family believe they have exceptional circumstances, an appeal for travel assistance may be made in accordance with Section 4 of the policy. This discretionary arrangement has not been changed. And this is all a very technical way of explaining that under the policy, if the apprenticeship or traineeship is run by an educational establishment and is full-time, the young person can apply for travel assistance in the same way as for any other post-16 course of study, but they may have to make special arrangements to get to any work placements involved.
Thank you, Prue. Now our final question, public question, is from Michelle Felton. I think Michelle is with us online. Is that right, Michelle? Are you there?
Yeah. Yes, that's right. Is that, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes. I think we can all hear you. Thank you. Welcome to the meeting. Would you like to ask your question?
Thank you very much for allowing me to ask my question. Apologies, I can't have my camera on because I'm using my son's computer and I can't find a camera. My question. The proposed policy acknowledges some SEND pupils post-16 cannot get to school via a personal transport budget, but they must apply for a personal transport budget, wait till the end of term personal transport decision, and then appeal for council organised transport instead. So the proposed policy construction and timeframes inevitably will result in some aborn SEND pupils who are unable to use a PTB starting their first term without the necessary transport assistance. Please could the exec amend this to allow parents to make the case for a need for council organised transport that cannot be met by the personal transport budget in the initial application, instead of waiting until after the personal transport budget is awarded. This would allow pupils to have transport assistance in place at the start of term and the council to avoid processing these applications twice. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Prue?
So travel assistance can be applied for at any time. We would advise that as soon as the young person knows where they will be travelling to for their post-16 education, that they submit their application for travel assistance. Officers will aim to determine initial applications within 10 working days of their receipt, although this may be slightly longer at busy times, which is July through to September. Section 15 of the post-16 policy provides details of the appeals procedure. If an appeal is required, a stage 1 appeal will be heard within 20 working days of a request being made. Should a case progress to a stage 2 appeal, then this will be heard within 40 working days of the request. Officers will always aim to process cases as quickly as possible. And please note that the time limits for appeals are a maximum time, not a minimum. I'm going to add something to the prepared response, because having listened to you ask your question, there is no end of term decision that you put in your question. There's an end of term personal transport budget. It won't be an end of term decision. It can be made at any time, and that's the point we're trying to make in the answer.
Thank you, Prue. Michelle, do you have a supplementary question you'd like to ask?
I would say thank you for clarifying that. I understood from the previous meeting, the meeting last week, that it was an end of term. The phrase "end of term decision" was used, so I was just a bit confused. My supplementary question. My supplementary question is just about this council organised transport. I was just trying to. Could you explain the logic behind a child reaching 16 who is assessed as not able to do independent travel, and who has had council organised transport all the time up until that point? Could you explain the logic of them not being able to use their personal transport budget for council organised transport, or to have council organised transport as an option if they're not able to have independent travel training? Thanks.
I will have an attempt. I may need to give you a written answer.
Thank you.
What we're trying to do is change the focus of post-16 transport for children with SEND so that it helps promote their independence, because as they move into adulthood and away from the children's services support, when they become an adult, there is not that wraparound support in the same way. There is support for them, but it's not quite as comprehensive. And we do want to promote independence where we can, but we do recognise there are children for whom that will never be appropriate. My instinct is something, the point that was made in an earlier supplementary. I think if your child is assessed as needing council operated transport at the moment, and it is quite clear that they will never be able to operate a personal transport budget, then the likelihood is it will just continue seamlessly, and there might need to be an appeals process, but it will be a very quick thing and decided in a few days, because there's no likelihood of them ever being likely to do it. But I do think there are more children than you might think who will be suitable for a personal transport budget or for independent travel training, and the reason we prioritise that is for their benefit rather than for the councils. So it's a change of approach. This doesn't come in until September 2024, and we will look at those smaller things. I think it will have to be a case of who we come across who falls into that category, and whether it operates as I've outlined. But I think it will, and we certainly do not plan to be in a situation where there's a long delay because we've forced everybody to have a personal transport budget who clearly isn't suitable for it, and then we make them wait months for a decision to do something else. That's certainly not the intention. The intention is to provide what they need in a timely manner.
Thank you very much, Prue. That brings us to a close for the public questions. Chris, I can see you've got your hand up, but I'm afraid the council's constitution doesn't allow you to ask a further question other than the one you've already submitted. But if you have a question, please write it down and submit it to us, and I'm sure Prue will provide you with an answer. Thank you. Okay, that brings to a close public question part of the meeting. The next item on the agenda is member question time. No members' questions have been submitted. So we move on to the substantive item for discussion. That is the revised policy itself, home to school transport revised policy. And before we go any further, I need to explain that, in fact, there are several supplementary papers that executive members have before them. I'm not going to discuss all of those now, but one of them specifically summarises the recommendations of the Children's Services Overview and Scrutiny Committee meeting on the 15th of August that relates directly to this item. So in a few minutes' time, I'm going to be inviting Councillor Andrew Mickleborough, who is the chair of the Children's Services Overview and Scrutiny Committee, to present the comments and recommendations of this committee to the executive. Before I do that, I should just make it clear to anyone watching that the executive has already received the full minutes of the Children's Services Overview and Scrutiny Committee. So we know of their contents, we know what they have recommended, but we have invited Andrew here to actually go through those recommendations and explain what the Overview and Scrutiny Committee felt was needed. Before I move to Andrew, though, I'm going to remind you that we have on our tables before us a set of revised recommendations that take into account what was discussed at the Children's Services Overview and Scrutiny Committee, and also what emerged from the consultation. So we will come later on to this green sheet with the revised recommendations. Now, before Andrew goes through the Overview and Scrutiny Committee's recommendations, I'm going to ask Prue to introduce this item.
Thank you, Stephen. This is going to be a slightly longer introduction to an agenda item than usual, and I've written it down, which is not my normal practice, and that's because I felt it was important to explain the background and more about the proposals, and I didn't want to miss anything. So what I'm bringing you tonight is a complete overhaul of the Council's home to school transport policies. We've held a public consultation on our proposed changes, and the outcome of that went to the Children's Services Overview and Scrutiny Committee on the 15th of August. And in a minute, we will hear from Andrew, the chair, about the committee's views. And I'd like to thank all the members of the committee for their constructive and thorough engagement on the policies. And I'd also like to thank everyone who responded to the consultation. And I note that many of the proposals we made won support. Home to school transport can be quite a highly charged issue if you have a school-aged child. And that is particularly true for parents of children with special educational needs and disabilities. I do understand how the idea of change can cause anxiety and concern for those parents and children. And I also understand that people may not have the rosiest view of the council, and that therefore the prospect of changing the policies immediately makes them fear the worst. On top of that, we have reformulated the policy over quite a short period of time, which quite possibly has stoked the idea that the outcome is predetermined. Coming at a time when the council is having to make cuts to non-statutory services, there is also bound to be a suspicion that we are simply after saving money and not looking at the interests of the children affected. Now, it's true that the home to school transport budget has exploded over the last few years, and it's also true that we wish to bring it under control. But these changes are not being made in order to produce a saving this year. They could not do that, because if we approve the new policies tonight, they will not come into effect until September 2024. There sort of is a financial driver behind the changes, but it's not a requirement to meet a savings target. It is more about trying to ensure that we make as efficient use of the limited resources we have as possible, and about delivering the maximum we can for the most children and young people we can, and in particular for those children who face the most challenges. We need to eliminate waste and inefficiency where it happens. So to give you an example, in the new policy, we will be asking people who've applied for transport for their children on medical grounds to supply the medical evidence within 20 days if possible. Previously, some cases have dragged on for months while we waited for the evidence, or indeed for any communication from parents. But we won't simply withdraw the transport if someone can't get their doctor to send in a letter within 20 days, provided that they communicate with us and tell us what the delay is. I hope you agree it's not sensible to allow a completely open-ended period to respond, but we're not going to cut people off after 20 days, come what may. There are some important issues to do with promoting independence for young people with SEND associated with the post-16 changes. But the main purpose of making most of the changes is to get a policy that will help us sustain the home to school transport service in the context where we have very limited resources. It's very difficult to quantify how these changes will affect the spend. That's one reason why there are no figures for costs. I think the most I can say is that we believe that the spend will not go up as much as it would have if we had not taken action. At this point, it would probably be good to talk about why this is happening now. Home to school transport policy has to be agreed a year before it comes into effect. So we need to have a new policy in place by mid-September this year in order to use it next year. Although we had been looking at the huge increases in the budget, which is around 90% over the last 4 years, we did not have an opportunity to look at how to address them at an earlier time. Bear in mind that we only became the administration in May 2022, and we had rather a lot to do in children's services, including ensuring we got a safety valve deal with the government to enable us to deal with a huge deficit on the SEND budget, which had been accumulating since 2017 and had begun to grow rapidly, and which could have bankrupted the council in the next 6 years if not dealt with. Part of the safety valve deal is about revising and improving our SEND offer. As part of that, last year we bid for and have been granted 2 additional SEND schools for the borough, which should be opening in about 2028. It is the creation of more SEND provision in the borough that is actually going to be of most benefit in reducing the home to school transport budget, not changes to the policy. Only having got through safety valve and also an Ofsted inspection in March, plus dealing with the critical shortage of school places, we then had to grasp the nettle of dealing with home to school transport. We didn't want it to be delayed for another year, so it had to be done at pace, and it has been, and I'm very grateful to all the officers who put in such a lot of effort to produce the policies. Despite the short time frame, as well as a public consultation, we've also had the policies subjected to a peer challenge and have taken external legal advice. This is a complex area and we don't want to get it wrong. In connection with that, it is important to make it clear there is no change to the fact that each case, particularly where SEND children and young people are concerned, will be looked at on its own individual merits. We are not going to try to make blanket decisions. That will be potentially discriminatory. It certainly would not be in the best interests of the child or young person. It is because each case is different that we cannot write the policies in such a way as to nail down all criteria. To give you another example, we cannot make a rule that all managed moves will or will not qualify for transport. It will depend on the circumstances of each managed move and the interests of the child. One of the thorniest issues in creating the new policy was trying to make sure the language was clear. And I think from the discussion that will take place in a minute with Andrew, it will become clear we did not always initially succeed in that. But I hope you will be able to see later on that we have listened. I think it is also important to mention that is not only the policy that will change. We will be writing guidance for parents and trying to make the links clearer between applying for a school place and your entitlement to transport. We'll also be working with all stakeholders to develop a travel training offer. Those things are not part of the actual policies, so they're not for our agreement tonight. Finally, I would like to say that we have tried to listen to everyone and have made and are making changes to the policy in response to feedback. I cannot promise that people will get everything they wanted, but I do believe we've gone a long way to meet their wishes. Thank you.
Thank you, Prue. I'm going to now invite Andrew to present to us the Overview and Scrutiny Committee's report on this proposed change of policy.
Good. Thank you, Stephen, and thank you to all the members of the executive for inviting me to attend tonight's meeting and for the opportunity to answer any questions that you might have arising from last week's extraordinary meeting of the Children's Services Overview and Scrutiny Committee. With your indulgence, I would like to just very briefly explain the purpose of Overview and Scrutiny. The committee consists of elected councillors as well as community representatives. The role of Overview and Scrutiny is to provide rigorous, independent, critical friend challenge and to work with the council's executive and other public service providers for the benefit of the public. The committee considers submissions from a range of sources and reaches conclusions and makes recommendations to the executive based on the weight of evidence, not on party political grounds. You have draft minutes from last week's extraordinary meeting that include the committee's recommendations and actions. I don't propose to go through each of those recommendations. I do wish to note that many of the matters that are addressed in those recommendations and in the other supplementary documents that we have before us, and in Prue's answers to questions and her introduction to this agenda item, actually address, many of the questions that you might have had. But before taking any questions, I would be grateful if I could draw particular attention to just three matters and explain a little bit the committee's thinking on each. So, recommendation 6A, you'll see the committee's recommendation that provision of travel assistance for children under statutory age continue. The context and the reasoning behind this is included on pages 3 and 4 in the draft minutes. Now, I note in the paper recommendation status in the revised policy under 6A, there is a note that it remains the case that the council may consider a request to exercise its discretion in a particular case to provide travel assistance, and that is specifically a reference to children under statutory school age. So thank you for that. Recommendation 6B refers, and we've heard a lot about this tonight, we considered it to be an extremely important matter, the continued provision of discretionary arrangements. However, the committee recognises that implicit in this is an acknowledgement that whenever individual cases are considered on their merits, the test of reasonableness, which has been mentioned again this evening, must always apply. This would be the case, for instance, in recommendation 6D pertaining to personal travel budgets, including the wording in the committee's original recommendation that the objective would be to cover all related costs. But again, this implicit in this was an understanding that this must be always subject to a test of reasonableness. Finally, the committee considered it important that young people eligible for post-16 travel assistance are supported to attend the nearest, most suitable educational setting providing for their chosen course. And we've had a number of references again to this matter tonight, including Mr. Roberts' question. This recommendation that the committee, the Overview Scrutiny Committee made, was opposed to or was a response to wording in draft documents referring to the nearest suitable level, of study. I believe that that matter has been addressed, and I think the committee would be very thankful, and many of our residents would be very, very grateful for that. I would, however, add the reminder, the caveat, that again, this is the test of reasonableness, must again continue to apply. So that's a little bit of the thinking behind just 3 of the recommendations that the Overview and Scrutiny Committee made, and I'm very happy to answer any questions that the executive might have.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you to you and your colleagues for the thorough job they did in reviewing the proposed changes and the recommendations they've made. And you're quite right, some of those have already elicited responses in the form of amendments, which we'll be coming on to later. I think rather than you're being asked questions, I think the format really is that I now invite Prue to respond to the points you've raised, and then I give executive members the opportunity to ask any questions I think of Prue that they may wish to, but they may wish to ask a question of you. So if you stay here, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
So thank you, Andrew. And it was a very well chaired meeting. And I say that there was covered a vast amount of ground in a very complicated manner. So the minutes had 6 recommendations, one of which is broken into 4 parts. So we've all got them in front of us. I'm not sure if the people online know what they are. So one of them is about a really important point that actually hasn't come up much this evening yet, and I think I probably will go through these recommendations. I know it will take a bit of time, but not in too much detail, but to make sure that the people online and in the chamber who haven't read this understand. So you noted and endorsed the fact that children who have been awarded travel assistance under the current policy will not have their support withdrawn on the implementation of the new policy. I think I did refer to that earlier. So change will happen whether there's a change in circumstances or when a milestone is reached. So, for example, when you move from primary to secondary or that kind of thing. And we have accepted that, and we've improved the wording in the policy to make that clearer. An interesting note, which I fully take on board, about the robust mechanisms needing to exist involving children's services, the corporate transport unit and adult social care services, to make sure that we provide enough support for parents to navigate this system. We are intending to improve the guidance and to make it much plainer. Then there's a note about Send Voices and the independent, promoting independence, and not just go on what's cost effective. It's not entirely clear. This is not the way we're going about it. It's. I think I've explained. We accept that we could have made that a bit clearer, but if families feel what it says here in the response to that particular one, the standard offer remains a personal transport budget, but following their application acceptance and approval of eligibility, if families feel the only way they can get their child to school is using traditional transport, they will be able to appeal the offer of a personal transport budget so the council can consider any individual and exceptional circumstances. And I think if we outline, we will be as flexible as necessary to meet the needs of the child. Each case will be different. That you were in favour of the programme of travel training, and I can reiterate again, we will be involving all the stakeholders in preparing that, including Send Voices, who have a representative on the committee. At the end of the consultation period, there was a technical glitch with the consultation site, and we did take some steps to make sure that anybody who might have been wanting to submit something on the last day of the consultation had an opportunity to resubmit. I'm not going to say it was perfect, but we tried to accommodate people. And we will be looking corporately and whether there's anything we can do with our engagement sites to improve that. Then you've got the provision of travel assistance for children under the statutory school age. This came out as a slightly unfortunately worded recommendation from the committee because it implied that we were going to do it as a general thing. And I think what we're going to do is we will still have the discretion in particular cases to consider the need based on the needs of the child. So it won't be an across the board thing. That we needed to improve the wording about discretionary stuff, as you brought out, we will be doing that, and improving the communication with the parents. And I think we can always improve our communication with parents, and we will be seeking to do that. And again, the last recommendation, which is about what costs the personal travel budget should cover. The word reasonable is a very helpful and that it is intended to do that. And there is a list in the policy of all the kinds of things that you can use it on. And basically it's anything that will help you get your child to school. But we cannot be expected to cover things that are not aimed at getting your child to school. And it does have to be reasonable, and that test of reasonableness is quite important. But we did set those limits, and they're distance limits, by benchmarking with other authorities. And although there was some discussion at the meeting about whether it mattered whether the provision was in the borough or outside the borough, because it's just purely based on distance, it doesn't really matter whose borough the provision's in. But obviously it would be better for us if we had closer provision, because then not only would the children not have to have such long journeys, but we might have a lower cost. So all of those, I think, have been accepted, and we're not throwing out any of them. So that's very good. But you also had a list of other things which were things you'd like us to consider. If it's all right with you, Stephen, I'll go through those as well. Because this is important, I want to make sure everybody knows that we've considered everything. So you wanted us to consider providing data relating to numbers and ages and cost of travel transport, in particular for under 5s and post-16s. I think I've provided some post-16 data about the 62 children. It's complicated. The number of under 5s that we currently transport is 7 children. I think it's a bit of a movable feast, and giving any more figures is not really going to help clarify the position. You've asked about the discretionary things. Again, that's being looked at, and more clarity on definition of what the most suitable school is and so on. We're providing more information on the Parents' Guide to School Admissions. We are going to try and link the two policies, the transport and the school admissions, more overtly. We're clarifying the technical things about qualifying and suitable schools. You've asked us to try and avoid ambiguity. We are desperately trying to avoid ambiguity. We will do our best to do that. And if anybody has an example of ambiguity in the document, you've probably got 3 or 4 days to get it to us before we finalise everything. One that hasn't come up at all this evening, which is important, I think, to make it more explicit that children attending schools out of the borough can be entitled to travel assistance, providing they met the eligibility criteria. That does confuse some people. They assume we provide it to our own schools, and no, it is purely on the geographical distance, and it doesn't matter where the school is. I've touched on subject to a managed move. It's very hard to nail that down because each one is different. The next one, we're nearly at the end now, Stevenson, don't worry. Make it clearer that SEND children are given more time to prepare for new travel assessments. We will deal with that on a case-by-case basis. So if children do need more time, clearly they will be given more time. And some children will be quite relatively quick. In relation to change of circumstances, to make it clear, any changes in withdrawal of travel support will be based on evidence. Clearly, we have to do that, because if you make a decision not based on evidence, it's not going to stand up. We will try and clarify that. You've asked us about the figures for post-16 travel assistance. I think I've answered that in earlier points. It's very difficult to do it. And then there's a reference to Send Voices and the statutory thing, which was in Terry's question, which was asked earlier. And it's all about that use of the word reasonable. And I think there's three more to go. Co-producing the travel training, yes, we've already covered that. The right of appeal, making the wording clearer, I think that is being looked at. One of the questions which has actually caused an awful lot of consternation was to review and clarify who will be considering and determining the outcome of parents' appeals, and clarification of what's meant by a senior officer. And that is being clarified, but there was a sort of sucking of teeth. Oh, what exactly do we mean by that? But we will nail it down, that particular one down. And to make communication very clear about what other sources of help for home to school transport may be available for families with low disposable income. That's being looked at. It probably won't appear in the policy itself. It will be in the accompanying documentation, because it's likely to change as well. And we don't want to change the policy, but we will be trying to signpost people to sources of help. And to endeavour to ease public participation in future consultation. That is the point about the thing. It's a bit clunky, and on the last day there was a little bit of an issue. It's something we will look at corporate. It's beyond my thing, but it has been fed in, and I think that's everything that Children's Services raised. So I think there wasn't anything you raised that we've gone, oh, what on earth was that? And so it was a really worthwhile exercise, and thank you for conducting it.
I'd just like to echo those comments of Prue's at the end. I think it's very clear that the Children's Services Overview and Scrutiny Committee has added real value to this process. The outcome of their deliberations and the comments on the consultation itself have led to revisions in the recommendations, which we'll be coming on to shortly. But I want to thank you, and I hope we can note in the minutes our thanks to Andrew and his committee for their hard work on this and very valuable work, which has added value to the original set of proposals, and I think has helped to clarify, amplify, and in some cases revise our thinking. So thank you very much, Andrew, and your colleagues. I'm now going to ask if any members of the executive wish to raise any questions. Lindsay?
Yes, thank you, Prue, and thank you, Andrew. My question is, there's been some confusion regarding buses. Can you confirm what this policy includes and does not include?
I think you're referring to the situation in Shinfield and the Embrook buses, that some people had got it into their heads that the consultation that we held on this policy change, which comes into effect in 2024 and is general, had something to do with the fact that as fare payers, they couldn't get their children onto buses coming from Shinfield. The two things are completely divorced. The timing was coincidental and unfortunate in some ways, but there is no connection between the two things. And all the issues with buses in Shinfield are under the current policy, which was introduced a couple of years ago by the previous administration, and we have worked. I have to say the councillors, and I would like to thank officers for working very hard on that issue. The problem there was people who are not eligible for free transport, and they had got the people are accustomed to buying up the spare places on buses, and there just weren't enough spare places for all the people who wanted one this year. But we've gone from 49 people without a place to 16 in the last 3 weeks, which I think is a huge improvement. And we were Shenfield Parish Council last night talking to people about what the options are, and we will be looking next year to see what we can do to help them. But they are completely separate issues. This is about eligibility for free transport, not really anything to do with provision of fair pay as places.
Thank you, Prue. Thanks for your question, Lindsay. That was helpful to get that matter clarified. Rachel.
Super, thank you. I'm pleased to see this policy will support children and young people in developing their independent skills in travel, with additional support where that's needed to help prepare them for adult life. I know, though, that there are some cases where we have young people who've got very profound disabilities who won't be able to develop this independence, even with tailored support. What support will we be providing for these young people?
Where young people are not going to be able to travel independently, there will still be that provision for the same sort of traditional council operated transport. So there will still be taxis or minibuses or whatever the particular need is. So we really don't want people to be too really worried about this, that we're going to force children into something which they can't do. That's not the case. It really isn't.
Super, thank you very much.
Thank you. The policy has provision for personal travel budgets to be reviewed where attendance at the school or college drops below 90%. Very sadly, the problem for many of our children and young people with special needs is that they can have low attendance due to their health conditions. How will these cases be handled?
So in the policy, there's actually a list of things which may cause the personal travel budget to be reviewed. They're things like persistent lateness or low attendance, but it would only be reviewed if it was the personal travel budget that was causing the problem and not the health condition of the child. So if the child can't attend school and it's nothing to do with how they're getting to school, then of course we wouldn't change anything. I think it's important to note that it does say something like it may rather than it will. So it could be all or any of those conditions, but it's really just to make sure that that personal travel budget isn't being used in a way which doesn't help the child get to school. That is the sole aim of it, help the child get to school by whatever means necessary.
Right, I think I don't see anybody else wishing to ask questions. So we're now going to move to the revised recommendations, which have taken account of the recommendations of the Overview and Scrutiny Committee and the responses to the consultation. And as this is a document that has been tabled today, it's not in the published agenda, it's appearing on your screen, but I'm going to read out the recommendations just so there's absolute clarity on what we are voting. So the document, which is on your screen and is in front of every executive member, reads as follows. It recommends that members, 1, note the impacts and mitigations set out in the Equality Impact Assessment, which is in Annex 1 of the published agenda. 2, notes the outcomes of the 28 working day public consultation, which is in Annex 2 of the published agenda. 3, approves changes to the home to school college travel assistance policies, having considered the above documents and the recommendations and actions arising from the Children's Services Overview and Scrutiny Committee meeting of the 15th of August 2023. 4, approves the revised home to school college travel assistance policies, taking into account the response to the recommendations and actions from the Children's Services Overview and Scrutiny meeting of the 15th of August 2023, delegating the final sign-off to the Director of Children's Services in consultation with the lead member for Children's Services. So that allows for final tidyings up and revisions. And it notes under 4 that this relates to 1, home to school travel assistance policy for children and young people 16 years old and under, including young people with special educational needs and disabilities. That's in Annex 3 of the published agenda. And 2, transport assistance policy for young people resident in Woking and post-16, including young people with special educational needs and disabilities. And that's in Annex 4 of the published agenda. And then the 5th recommendation, approve the implementation of the new travel assistance policies from the academic year commencing September 2024. And finally, recommendation 6 of the revised recommendations agree that the Director of Children's Services, in consultation with the Executive Member for Children's Services, has delegated authority to approve the statement every year where there are no substantial changes. So could I ask for all those who are in favour to raise their hand? And that is carried unanimously. Thank you, everyone. I don't believe there are any other items of business. I think that means we have completed our business for this evening. Thank you very much to everyone who's attended, either online or in person, for your contributions, for your questions, and Andrew for his report on the Overview and Scrutiny Committee recommendations. Thank you, everyone, and good evening.